if you go under tests exam, and then under lab test preparation there, you can see that, so this is actually the procedure for you to follow to install ETF in your home machine. But in the lab test, you're actually going to use the person machine. So I would suggest for this lab exercise, you can simply just use the lab machines. It's up to you. They should be the same. But you should always make sure you practice in the person lab. Okay, what I want you to download right now is, you can see under step 2. So download the 3 following files here. So go to here. Okay, so now download definitions.txt, input.txt, and inputbed.txt. Download these 3 files first to somewhere on your, let's say, I will just create a new directory here on my desktop. I can call that, let's say, bank project, for example. Okay, and then I'm going to store all the 3 files here. Okay, download all the 3. And bank project here. And then inputs, 2 input file basically. Okay, that's all you have to download for this lab. And then if you go to your bank project directory on your desktop, for example, you will see all the 3 files. Okay? Make sure you have done these. Okay, so now let's have a quick look on the 3 files. So the first one is called definitions.txt. So this is the abstract user interface I was talking about yesterday in the lecture. So this basically defines how the user might interact with your application software. Okay, so here if you look at from line 6 onwards, the one I'm highlighting now, it's saying you have 4 possible ways to interact with the bank system. So you can see from line 1, this is always the, it's like we are trying to follow a grammar for the definitions. Line 1 always have to start with system and then a name of the system. In this case, it's called bank. And then, so here we just have some type definitions, which I will go over in a moment. But here we're saying you basically have 4 possible events. So each event actually represents some kind of interaction between the user and the bank system. So you might have a new event, you might have a deposit event, you might have a withdrawal, or you might have a transfer. And for the new event, you're going to specify some ID for the new owner, for example, Steve or Bill. And for the deposit, you're actually going to specify basically 3 things. You have to say which owner I have to deposit the amount into, and also the amount, and also the dates. One thing you should note is, here you can see the dates. The date here is not really exactly like the dates you see in Eiffel Studio. The date is actually defined above. So you can see that, so here we have some syntax for you to define some types in your own words. So here we'd say, we define a new type, so type is a keyword for specifying the grammar. So we'd say day is actually a type, and it actually ranges from 1 to 31, because you might have up to 31 days for each month. And also month is another type, which might range from 1 up to 12. And then you have year, which might range from 1800 up to 2500. And now the dates you see over here is defined here. We're saying each date is basically a tuple. A tuple is simply a list of elements. And the list has 3 components there. The first component is called day. And the second component is called month. And the third component is called year. Okay, that's exactly how we represent the dates. Okay, this is actually just how we specify the abstract user interface. In the lab test, you will be given this file. Okay, so you don't actually have to worry too much about the grammar. I just want to explain to you what we're trying to do. What we're doing here is to specify the abstract user interface for the application. In the lab test, what you will be asked to do is you have to know how to generate your Eiffel project from this definition file, okay, which I'm going to show you now. And you should also practice yourself as well. Okay, given that we got this definition for the abstract user interface, so we can launch your terminal. Let's say we go to, in my case, I'll go to desktop, and then the bank projects. Okay, So if you list all the contents in your directory, you will see you have the definitions.txt and the two input files. So those are the files which you will run to test your software. They are called the acceptance tests, as I mentioned yesterday in the lecture, as opposed to unit tests. Okay? If you have a look at the two input file, for example, input.txt. So here, you can only use the events that are actually defined as part of the abstract user interface. So you can see the new was actually declared in the abstract user interface, and deposit was, and withdraw and transfer, they are all valid events to specify in your your interface. So in this input.txt, we call that an acceptance use case. So over there, you're trying to say this is a particular scenario of the interaction between the customer and the software system. And we would expect some outputs from there, which I will show you in a moment. Okay, so you got to be very clear that we do have two categories of text files. The first category is for defining the abstract user interface, and you will use that to generate your ETF projects. And the second category is the use case file for you to do the acceptance tests. Okay, make sure you don't get confused. Let's generate an ETF framework. So now, ETF should be already available in your either local PC or on the Prism Lab. Let's say if you simply just do ETF, it's going to give you some error messages because you always expect it to give some command line arguments for the ETF program. So they said, wrong number of arguments. What you have to do, for example, you can say ETF-help to actually see how you can use that. So if you do that, okay, it's actually going to give you some like a manual page. Okay, you can read it over just to familiarize yourself. Typically, you have three things you can do with the ETF generator. Either you can generate a new project from scratch using the -new flag, or let's say if you have some existing projects already that was first generated by ETF, but now you want to renew your projects. That's what the renew does. And also you can use the help. Okay. And for each, for the new flag, we have to specify the definitions.txt file, the abstract user interface, and we have to say what's the target directory to generate the projects. Okay, it can be any valid path you want to specify. Let's try to do that. Okay, just to remind you, so now we are in the bank project directory. So we're going to generate everything within there. So what we're going to do is to say ETF-new, and then so we would say definitions.txt. So here I'm going to say I'm going to put everything that's generated inside the current directory. So I would say dot. So dot means the current directory. Okay, ETF-new definitions.txt and dot. Okay, if you hit enter, it's going to generate all sorts of stuff in your directory. Okay, so
excuse me. How did you find the definitions?
you got to download it from the web. Okay, so if you go to the course website here, so you can see that. Have a look here. So if you see the under tests exam, and then step 2 of the lab test preparation, they say here, right? If you go in there, you will see all the 3 files. All right?
Yep.
Good. Okay, so let's continue here. So we have just generated all these files from ETF. Just say list. So you can see now we actually got many directories and files generated for you already. By default, everything that's generated from the ETF generator is compilable already. So let's just compile from that and see what's going to happen. So there are 2 ways for you to compile the projects. Either you can do it the old way. You can just launch the Eiffel Studio and use the ECS file to initialize your projects, or you can simply just do the command line compilation, which will be very useful later on for your projects. I'll just do the command line version, since that might be the one you haven't used so far. You should have EC-1505, so that's the Eiffel compiler as opposed to Eiffel Studio. And then you would say, we're going to say -C compile, because we're going to compile the C code, and we're going to finalize the code. Okay? So dash C underscore compile dash finalize configure, and then we'll say bank.ecf. Okay, so we're using the Eiffel compiler. We're going to compile the C code, we're going to finalize, and we're going to configure the project from this particular ECF file. Okay, you don't really have to memorize that, but you just have to know how to use it. We do actually document it down on the wiki page. Okay, if you do that, it's going to start compilation to actually try to finalize your projects. Once this is done, what you should do is go to the ifgen directory and find out the executable and execute from there. That's what you should do. So remember I said yesterday, there are actually several modes for you to interact with the ETF projects. You have the GUI mode, you have the interactive mode, and you have the batch mode. By default, we have the GUI mode. If you want to switch between the modes, you do have to modify the source that has been generated and recompile. And then you actually change to that mode. But I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so everyone so far so good? Okay, let's wait a bit. Any questions so far? Yeah.
I'm trying to use the new option, but it doesn't work. It gives me errors. What's the problem?
What did you type?
It said ETF plus dash new valid option. So it seems to be.
No, you should say ETF dash new and then definitions.txt and then dot. So you have to specify those arguments.
So, question: am I supposed to compile something after I just did the?
You know, just compile the projects.
So I did this after.
You don't have to do it again. You have done that already. Yeah. Okay, so make sure, once I posted the video today online, make sure you really familiarize yourself within the lab test, because no one's going to help you during a lab test. Okay? You still have time to do this training for yourself. Okay, so now it's completed. So let's see. If you list, you can see that you have the ifgens directory here. So that's where the executable is stored. If you go in there, if you go, for example, you can simply say ifgens, okay, and then we have bank. And since we have finalized our code, so it will be called F code. F stands for finalized. If you actually simply just freeze your code, you'll be W code, standing for working code. And then we'll say bank. So this is already some executable from the default projects. So you can already execute that. So if you simply hit that, it's going to launch some GUI for you. Okay? Has anyone seen that? If you simply launch that. Okay, you have to type this. ifgens, bank, fcode, and bank. Anyone has seen that already? No one? You want to see it? Have you compiled the project already? Stuck? Oh, it's still compiling. I think yes, because I'm using my local Mac, it's actually much faster. Maybe I'll wait you guys a little bit. Okay? But it's still compiling, right? Okay, that's fine.
For me, it's not working. Because it says.
I think you have generated the project already. No, you haven't.
If I go back to this directory I generated, but there's no project.
No, actually you had to compile the projects after you have
Yeah,
generated.
that's what I wanted to ask. You said I didn't have to. So do I look at it compile?
Well, you gotta. So that's that's something. Yeah, you have to follow this. You have to go back to just go to the wiki page and copy and paste the command. All right. All right. So have you finished compiling, or is still compiling? Stuck. That's a disappointing. If you really get stuck, maybe I should just continue. You guys can keep watching. You can still rewatch the video and try to follow that. Okay. You know what? I think I'll just continue, and then you can still watch the video after today. Okay. So now, This is the default GUI that we have. Okay, so this is some GUI which will, by default, you will simply get this behavior. Okay, and this is a GUI mode. If you want to switch from GUI mode into interactive mode or to the batch mode, that's something you have to change in the source, which I will show you in a moment. But you can already do something with the GUI mode. Just let me show you a bit. You can also play with that later. So here you can see the GUI mode. So this is also explained in the video I posted before. So here in the GUI mode, first of all, it tells you what event you might specify for your system and what's the type for its arguments. So here you have new, you have deposit, you have withdraw, and you have transfer. So these commands, these events correspond exactly to the abstract user interface file that you actually ask the ETF generator to generate. So you can see that you have different icons here, and you can, for example, I can say new Steve. Okay, so because you can see here, Steve is actually a string which matches the type of string here for the new. If I do that, I say you can either hit enter or say execute. If you do that, it's actually going to tell, so this panel here, right-hand side panel here is called the history panel. It tells you what events has occurred so far. So here we only have the new event occurring so far. So let's say I want to add another, let's say another owner, Bill, let's say. Okay, so now you can see the history here is expanded with one event. Okay, so we have Bill and we have Steve. But one thing to note, this panel here tells you what's the resulting states by the event occurring. So here you can see that system states, default model states. So this is to say, since you haven't defined any business model yet, so this is just a default behavior the ETF generates for you. So your job is also to define the business model appropriately. Okay? So in the lab test, step 1, you have to know how to generate from the definitions file into the ETF projects. Step 2, you have to properly define your business model and make sure the output is displayed properly. So those are the 2 steps you have to know how to do in the lab test without any help. Okay? So that's a GUI mode. You can play with that and also watch the previous video I posted. I actually said quite in details how you do that. Okay, so now how do we switch between the modes? The way to do it is by launching the Eiffel Studio. Okay, so now we're gonna say eStudio 1501, and then we'll go for bank.ecf, launch that. Okay, has the compilation finished? Or, okay, still hanging. I think eventually it will finish, hopefully. Right, so that's Eiffel Studio, nothing magic here. So I just want to show you one thing at a time. Okay, so maybe pay attention to the cluster structure here. Okay, so you can see there are only 3 clusters that have been generated for your ETF projects. So the bank here, guess what? The name over here corresponds to the system name in your abstract user interface file. Let me remind you, remember in that file there, definitions.txt, because you say the system should be called bank. So that is going to call the cluster called bank in the generated projects. That is where you should store your business logic, your business model. Okay? Okay, so we have a bank cluster and we have a generated code cluster. This is a cluster that you typically don't have to change unless you are asked to change explicitly. Your main job is to change the bank cluster, but nothing else. Oh, and also you have the root cluster. And the root cluster is where you can switch the modes of your ETF project. So currently we are in the GUI mode, but let's have a look. So if you go to root class, let me maximize that. Okay, don't worry about the structure just yet. You can see that there is a feature or attribute here that is actually of type integer. It's simply called switch. So basically, if you want to switch from GUI into some command line mode, you have to change the value for switch. That's the key. But what value should you change? You should look at the list of possible modes that are actually available. So here, we actually got some comments already. So the one you typically need, you you can simply just do ETF CL stands for command line. So you can ETF command line show history. So that's what you should typically do. Okay. You should actually play with different modes to see what difference they have. Also watch my previous video. So now I'm going to copy this string here, and then I'm going to change the right-hand side of the assignments for switch. So now if I do that, okay, I'm going to say compile, and then since we just finalized the code, so typically you have to freeze the code to recompile. Okay, go to compile here and say freeze. Okay, so now after the freezing procedure is finished, there won't be any GUI anymore by default. It will be the command line arguments. That's where I want to show you. Okay, so let me just minimize the Eiffel Studio now, and let me go back to the command line. Okay, remember we used to have this, right? So now, if you simply, let me see if I have done anything wrong. Let me have a look. Maybe I didn't recompile properly. Let me have a look. Command line show history. Okay, I got it. Okay, so this one common mistake. Because we just freeze the code, so the executable after you freeze the code is going to be stored in so-called a W code subdirectory under ifgen. As I said before, there are actually two possible subdirectories under ifgens. Either F code, standing for finalized code, or it can be W code, standing for working code. Okay, let me just show you what I meant. So now, if you go into ifgens, and you go to bank, so now you can see that we actually have F code here, and we also have W code here. F code is after you finalize the code, they will actually store the executable here. That's actually the GUI version because we just finalized it. But now, since we recompile and freeze the projects again, so now after freezing, the up-to-date executable will be stored in the W code. Okay, just make sure you go to the right directory. Okay, so now what I need to do is instead of saying F code, I'm going to say W code. Okay. Okay, ifgens, bank, W code, and bank. Okay, so now you can see now there's no GUI invoked, and this is some. Let me just do it again. Somebody didn't do it properly. ifgens, bank. Okay. That's weird. Why didn't I see that? ifgens. Let's say if this actually happens in your prison lab, let's say, sometimes Eiffel Studio behave weirdly. Sometimes. Exit from Eiffel Studio, and on your prison lab, maybe you haven't really noticed that, there's some command on the prison lab that's called eclean. It's actually going to clean up your ifgens directory. Sometimes you may have to do that. Okay, you'll say eclean, the current directory. Let me do it again. Okay, let me that's not really what I want. Not sure why. That's really weird. Okay, freeze, and then okay. Okay, so sorry for the confusion. So I do appreciate that. It's actually very confusing what I just did. So I might just reconsider doing the lab test to actually do you a favor. I might just give you some startup projects so you don't actually have to generate ETF and play with the compilation. Even myself could actually make a mistake on the fly. Anyway, so now what you have to know is for your project, you will really be given some events file for you to generate the ETF projects. Sometimes, just about freezing the project or finalizing the project is something you have to play with the Eiffel Studio. But now in the lab test, I think to save your time, I might just give you something that can give you to get started right away on the business model. Okay, so now, assuming that you have already switched to the command line mode, if you go back to Eiffel Studio, let me just repeat what I just said. Okay, so if you go to the root class there, so I gotta open the correct project there. Okay, if you go to root class there, one thing you should really notice is for your projects, sometimes you might find it easier to actually use the command line mode rather than the default GUI mode, just for you to do the testing. So that's what I just did. I changed that and recompile, and then now I'm trying to run the recompile projects. So now I shouldn't see the GUI brought up anymore. Let me minimize that. I'll close this. Okay, so now if I simply just say, now I want to invoke the bank executable now from the working code because I just freeze it after recompiling it. If I simply do this, it tells me that now we're actually in the command line mode. You have to specify some command line arguments. Okay, so here they say if a mode is not specified for the command line mode, so you gotta say now either I want to do the interactive or want to do the batch mode. Okay, so now you can do -help to actually give you some manual. So if you simply just do the original program and say help, it's going to give you some manual here, just not displayed properly on my terminal right now, but later on, the main mode you have to use will be these two. You'll be the -I for interactive and also -B for the batch. Okay, these two will be necessary for you. And let me just demonstrate to you. For example, we can do -I. So -I here. So -I here is going to let you play with the projects.
So can you still use the -I and -B even if you change the settings inside the root?
No, you cannot actually because by default it's a GUI mode, so you can only interact with the GUI. But if you want to use -I or -B, you have to change that. But I think that for the lab test, I might just give you some startup projects which you can launch the -I and -B directly. That's something I will tell you explicitly. Okay, so now I'm in the interactive mode. So now I can interact with the program as I said yesterday. So now we have the > sign. So here we can enter some events. So you can see that before that, it is before the event occurred. And after that, it will be the after the event occurred. So I can say new Steve. Okay. After that, it's going to tell me that I'm changed from state 0 to state 1. This is just the default behavior for the projects because we haven't plugged in the correct business model yet. Okay. So now you can see after we have the events new Steve occurring, we actually change from state 0 to 1. We can just do another one. Let's say we do deposit, and then so here deposit. Let's say deposit something from Steve, 10 for example, and then if we simply do that, okay. So this is one example of the error checking that's already done for you. Remember, if you refer back to the abstract events file, there. Let me show you. So you can see that here, for the deposit, we have to specify a string for the name, and also real number for the amount. Also, we need a dates over there. So the type is not exactly correct. So we're missing one argument value. So the way to fix that, so now we can do deposit Steve, and here we can say, let's say simply 1/1/2001, for example. Okay, and I forgot about the amount. So Steve, 20, let's say, 1/1/2001. What did I forget? If that's a real number, maybe I should say, for example, like that. It's a tuple, and then I can say 1/1/2001. Okay, yeah, okay. It's a bit. You just have to make sure the type is correct. Anyway, you get a feel of how the interactive mode might work. Okay, let me show you one more mode, and then I will show you the most important part for your lab test: how you can change the business model. Okay. Now let me go to the. If you want to exit from there, you can simply say quit. Okay, that's how you do it. So now we're going to do some test cases that might seem a little bit more interesting. So remember, we actually downloaded two files here, input text and input bat. So these are suitable for the batch mode, which means we are trying to run the use case that is specified in a particular file. So we're going to now, instead of saying -i, we're going to say -b, standing for batch mode. And then we're going to say, now I want to run input.txt. Okay? So we're going to run this particular use case on the Eiffel projects, on the ETF projects. Okay? What you would expect to see will be very similar to the output from the interactive mode. If you simply do that, you can see it actually runs all the events in the use case in one go without pausing, in each particular step. Okay, that's actually one use case here. So let's say for your lab test, let's say if I give you this as a lab test, I would say after new build, you should really have some proper state updates. So this is just default. So I'm not really seeing the proper updates. So that's something you have to change in your business model. So what I would do is, I would say, if I run in this particular use case, I will have some expected outputs. And I will compare my expected output file with your generated output file. Okay, that's a big picture. So now, this output simply is output to your screen. If you want to output that to a file, you can also do that. So we're still running the batch mode. You can just specify one more file. You can say output.txt. Okay, if you do that, it's now going to write a new file in your system. It's called output.txt. So this is something that's generated exactly the same. Okay, so now you should really get a feel like we have three different modes for the ETF project: GUI mode, interactive mode, and the batch mode. I think in the lab test, I might just set up the default mode to be the command line, so it'll be easier for you. So because usually GUI is just for you to get a feel of the application. But for the lab test, you simply don't have the time to enjoy the GUI. You just want to run the batch mode to do your test cases. Okay, so now let me go back to Eiffel Studio and show you briefly how you might change the business model. Okay? So now let me go to eStudio 1501 and then bank. Actually, I have that open already. Okay, here. Okay. So now the cluster you should go into is the bank cluster. That's where the business model is stored. Okay, if you go in there, so currently you can see under the bank, so there are different subclusters. The one you need to worry about now is called the model cluster. Okay, under here we actually have some default model for you. So we have ETF model and ETF model access. This reminds you about any of the design patterns we have taught so far. Singleton pattern, right? Yeah. So now it will be your exercise to figure out how the singleton pattern works for the model. So the idea is, for the ETF projects, the business model is going to be shared by the input and output. So whenever you make a change to the single model, it's going to be reflected to the output. Okay? That's something you have to figure out by doing some exercise. So now, if you look at the default model that's generated for you, if you go into ETF model here, oh, by the way, if you look at ETF model access, that's exactly what we taught in the class. So you have the run routine, and you have the expanded class, and etc. And you also have the invariant here to make sure there's only one single instance for data. And we're going to the default model class there, ETF model here. So let's have a look. So for example, let's say eventually for this particular example, you want to change from ETF model into a bank system. Okay, I'll show you how to do that change. But let's have a look quickly. So you can see that, so currently we have a very simple class called ETF model here. It simply redefine the out feature from the any. Okay, out is like a toString method in Java. And here we're saying we simply have two attributes. We have a string and we have some integer. And then the most critical thing is, so you can see that we have some operations here. And in this particular example, we have different operations for the bank. We have deposit, we have new, and we have withdraw and transfer, etc. And also we have a way to reset the model. And here, this is also very critical. So this is actually what you see from the terminal when you whenever you type in an event. So I'm saying for this default model here, whenever I hit an event, do some updates, this is how I output the resulting states. I'm always going to say system state, default model states, and I'm going to print out some counter. That's exactly what you saw from the terminal there. If I just bring you back, you can see that we have system state, default model states, and we have some counter that has been incremented. Okay, that's how it changed. Let me just show you to get a flavor. Let me do the following. Let me say system states. I will just get rid of the system. Okay, if I do that, and I will say compile, and see what happens. Okay, let me just output that to the terminal. Okay, you can see now we don't have the system anymore because I just get rid of that from the out feature. So that's really the key. So typically, for your project and for the lab test, first thing you got to make sure is the out feature for your business model is defined correctly. So when I evaluate your submission, I'm actually going to evaluate the output from your software, and then I'm going to compare character by character, and then to see if you got exactly the output. Okay. Okay, that's one thing for you to keep in mind. So now, let's see how we can gradually adapt to the bank system. Okay. So now let's do the following. So first of all, you can just use the renaming tool for the in the Eiffel Studio. So you can right-click on the class, and then you can say refactor, and then you can say rename. So now we're going to rename from ETF model into a bank. Okay, we're going to rename it. So nothing's changed, except we are trying to use a bank. Okay, so now for the ETF model access, you can also rename that into bank access. Just to get a better name. Bank access here. Okay. Okay, so now we simply, instead of having ETF model and ETF model access, we have bank and we have bank access. Okay, that's the only change we have made. So now, if we go back to the bank, so this still is not very good, not very satisfactory, but one thing I want to draw your attention to. So you can see here, we have only one possible updates operation for the default model, which is called default updates. But you want to see where that particular feature is called, because later on, if you actually want to change, eventually for your bank system, you want to have different operations. One operation that corresponds to the deposit events, one operation that corresponds to the new events, and you want to make sure they are actually called in the right place. Okay, let me show you. So if you go back to the cluster structure here, so remember we have bank here. So here, instead of model cluster, go into the abstract UI, the abstract user interface cluster there, and you have user commands. So one thing you have noticed is, so here we have we all have the ETF underscore prefixes, and here we have deposit, we have new, we have transfer, and we have withdraw. So this is actually how, whenever the user types something on the keyboard or on the terminal, something is going to be, that input is going to be read by these command classes. And then from those command classes, they're going to call the corresponding model operations that we just saw. Let's have a look at one of them. So if you look at the deposit, ETF deposit here, so you can see that, so we are trying to call the default updates on the model. Okay, so that's the only operation that's available by default. But later on, you have to make sure you have to create some model operation that corresponds to the deposit and make sure the model.deposit will be called over here. Okay, let me show you exactly what I meant. And you should really do the exercise by yourself as well. It really takes some time. Okay, so let's go to the bank. Okay, let's make a very simple bank. So let's say we have so attributes for the bank. Okay, let's say we have one single owner. Okay, you can expand it later. It will be your exercise. So we have an owner there, and also we have the balance for the owner. Let's say that's also, let's say it's a real. I believe deposit takes a real number. Let me make sure. Yeah, deposit takes a real number. Yeah. Real number here, okay? Just one single owner and one single balance, okay? And now, of course, in the make feature, we have initialized the owner. Okay? Okay, it compiles. So now, what? So let's say you have properly defined your owner and balance. So now there are two other things to do. One is to define the proper model operations. And the second thing is to make sure your out feature is properly defined. So now to change your model operation here, so now we're going to say model operations for bank. Okay, let's say we have some operation for deposit. So for deposit, we're going to say simply some owner. So some amount, real number here, okay? Okay, so here we simply say balance, which is another attribute here. Balance is equal to balance plus amount, okay? That's a very simple updates we're doing. So now we're going to change the way we define the out feature, okay? The way we do it is simply to say, the state so we're going to say that the way we define the out feature is going to print out the current state for the bank. The way we do it is by saying, for example, we can say result create result dot make empty. Depending on what I really require the output state to look like, I can define the out feature differently. Okay, it depends. So now I can say result dot append. Okay, so I can say owner, and then I can say result dot append, and I can simply append the value of the owner here, which is in attributes. And then I can append a new line at the end. Okay, and here I can say result, the append, and balance here. So far I'm only modifying the business model class, which is what you should do also for your lab test and projects. Okay, so here the balance will be simply balance here. Balance that out, I believe. Okay, so now it compiles. Let me just also put a new line at the end. Okay, so now what we should expect to see later on is to say, whenever we actually invoke some events from the software, we're actually going to see this model state instead. Okay, let's see what happens now. Okay, compile, then let's see. You can see that initially the balance should be 0 and the owner should be, let me just make from string, let me just make some foo, okay? Actually, I can say no owner yet. Okay, compile. And now, if I do run the same test cases, okay, you can see that now the way we output the state has completely changed. So initially the balance is simply 0 and the owner is no owner yet. Okay, you can see even after we say new bill, the owner hasn't been changed. It is because in the abstract command over there, we are not really calling the correct implementation. Okay, I'm going to show you how to change that. Okay, so always remember, once you have defined your business model properly, you have to somehow connect it to the abstract commands. That's the missing step, really. Okay, let me show you how to do that. Okay, so you're convinced that we definitely have changed the output already, but we haven't changed the way the business model is actually connected with the abstract commands. So let's have a look. If we go to, let's say we now want to make sure the new owner, so you can see we have deposit. So here you have deposit, we have new, we have transfer, and we have withdraw. Let me just do one more set of operations. So let me go back to the bank here, and now I can say, let's have another operation here. So let's say we have new, and new owner, which is a string, and we'll simply just override the existing owner. Is equal to new owner here. Okay, make sure it compiles. So now let's say we have finished defining the business model. What we should do is to make sure under the user commands, we are really calling the correct model operation. Okay, if you go to the ETF deposit, for example, to new, ETF new here. So now we want to get rid of that. That's simply calling some default updates, which is not really useful to us. So we can say model dot new, okay, and then simply the ID. So this ID here corresponds to this ID here. That is whatever you type, in the text file. Okay, that's the first update we'll do, and then let's also go to deposit. Okay, so now you can see that model dot deposit. Okay, here we would say the amount. Okay. Okay, that also compiles. So basically, what you really have to also explore yourself is how the inputs that's read from the command line is actually somehow passed to the business model. That's something you also have to explore. Okay, we simply wouldn't have time in the lab session. Just want to show you the most critical thing. Now let's go back. Okay, we have just recompiled that, and now let's do it again. Okay, one thing you can notice is if I recompile, let me just make sure we recompile. Yep, owner is equal to new owner. Okay, so now you can see that initially there's no owner yet, but after first we say new bill, the owner now becomes bill, right? So that's why we are now really calling the corresponding, the right model operation. We have done the correct updates. Okay, so this just shows you the idea how you can change the model and make sure it's properly connected to the input and output modules in the ETF. Okay, so now one more thing I would like to show you, one more thing. So let's say, remember I said yesterday, so now in the model cluster, you have to follow the design by contract principle, which means you got to think about what kind of preconditions you might have for your feature. So let's say for the owner here, I simply don't accept any string that's actually empty. So I would say require the new owner here dot is empty. That simply cannot be true. Okay. If I say this, okay. So now if I go back to the ETF new over here, you can see that if I say model.new ID, so here I'm not checking anything to see before I call this model.new, is this ID actually an empty string? If it is, it's actually going to crash the system by giving me some contract violation. Let's see. That's actually the ATM example I gave to you yesterday. As I said, let's say you're trying to withdraw some amounts that already exceed your daily maximum. You wouldn't actually be able to crash the ATM machine. What the ATM machine would do is to display on the output panel to say, no, you have reached your daily maximum. You should withdraw maybe tomorrow. Things like that. Okay, so now let's just try that without the error checking. Okay, so now let me just do the interactive mode. So now, if initially there's no owner here, but let's say I want to add new, simply just empty string here. You can see that. So this will actually violate the new operation precondition. If I simply do this, what happened? I managed to crash the system actually. So just imagine that the thing I just did is like when I am interacting with the ATM machine and I'm trying to withdraw some amount that exceeds my daily maximum, and somehow the ATM machine just crashed or just explode. It's a little bit like that. That's certainly not acceptable. When you're a customer is actually interacting with your software, they should never see software crashing. Okay, so how do we resolve this? The way to resolve this is not to get rid of the precondition, of course. That would be too bad. Certainly, under the model cluster, you always have to make sure you follow the design by contracts principle. But now, what we should do is to say, this ETF new abstract commands, this is where we are trying to handle the execution of the business model. So what we would do is, we would say, if ID is empty, then we actually output some error messages. IO dot, for example, put string, and then owner name cannot be empty. Okay, there will be some better way to do this error handling, but I will actually show you later. But today, I just want you to know where to do it. Okay. If the ID is actually empty, then you actually output some error message. Otherwise, you can safely call the operation from the business model. Okay, let's try again. Okay, and now if I say new empty string, it's going to output some string here. There's some trick for you to follow here. Give me a second. ETF command. Okay, let me do the following. What we should do is to have another feature for the bank to actually set some error. Okay, so error reporting. Okay, so here we would say, I'm just making one example, so there will be a bit different way of doing it. So we can say has error here. Okay, set error. Okay, so here we have some error message here, string. Okay, so here we'd say error being a string. Let's say initially create error message dot, I think that's called error, dot make empty. Okay, so now we're just having some extra attribute here. If the business model is in error, then we should do something. So now, here we can say in the out feature here, we can say if we do have some error here, dot is empty is not true. So we do have some error there. Then we will actually simply assign the output states to be the error. Otherwise, we're going to do the normal procedure of updates. Okay, I will show you a better way to do it maybe in next Wednesday's lecture. So it is a good pattern of doing it. Okay, so you can see what I'm doing now. So I'm just modifying the business model in such a way that you might be able to actually have some error there, and then you can set it, and then it will actually affect the way you output the model states. Okay, so let me just quit from there and make sure I recompile here. If I do this, new empty string, oh, doesn't really change, does it? One thing I forgot to do. So here I gotta say, if So now I'm back to the abstract command. So I gotta say model.setError. Okay. ID cannot be empty. Okay. You can see that from the input and output handler, either the ID I'm trying to pass is empty, or I can do the normal operation. Okay. Compile, and then let me quit from here. Do that. New empty string. Okay. You can see now we actually got some error message properly output rather than crashing the whole system. Okay? Now, your task is to try to get a feel of how you might be able to improve the outputs of the bank system. Because currently we simply just have, if you go back to the bank model here, you can see we only have a single owner and we have balance. But a proper bank account should be, you have an array or a list of owners and also have their corresponding balances. Try to see if you can improve this and then as an exercise. And then next week, I'm going to release the lab test where I will actually detail to say what you should do as the outputs and how you should really do your model states. Okay, so you only have until next Wednesday to do this simple exercise. Okay, I'm going to post a video as well today, so you can also have a look at that before you start. Any questions? All right, so